You're too independent, Kara. Dean said that at a moment when the only sound left in the kitchen was the dishwasher running. No reason. No argument leading up to it. Just a sentence dropped into the air like he was announcing some kind of technical error in our marriage. I looked at him. Calm. No frown. No accusing tone. Just a simple question I knew he didn't want to hear. Then who do you want me to depend on? Dean paused, like someone who'd missed a step on the stairs and tried to pretend nothing happened. His eyes passed over me, then away, then back again. But he didn't answer, not because he didn't hear me, because he didn't have a pretty enough answer to cover what he was really thinking. And what sent a chill down my spine wasn't the sentence itself. It was the way he looked at me afterward. Like the problem was me. Like the fact that I could stand on my own 2 feet was some kind of threat. In that moment, I knew something was very wrong. Wrong in a quiet way. Wrong in a way that makes you snap awake inside your own life. To understand it, I need to go back a few months. Back then, I still thought my marriage was fine. Not passionate, but steady in a grown-up way. I'm quiet, the observing type. I don't like making noise. Dean was the opposite. He was polite, smooth, always had something to say about everything. With other people, he showed up at the right moment and knew how to present himself. I used to think that was charming. A little mystery, a little unpredictability. Just enough to keep a marriage from feeling dull. But looking back, there were small details I ignored. Comments Dean tossed out like harmless observations. You're getting too strong. You always manage on your own, don't you? It's not always a good thing that you know how to do everything, Kara. I used to hear those lines like they were compliments. Like he was proud I was steady and capable. Like he liked having a wife who didn't depend on him. Now I'm not so sure. I remember once, Dean forgot to pick me up after I met a friend. It was drizzling, and I stood under the awning, texting him. No response, so I grabbed a cab home. When I opened the door, Dean looked up from his phone and said, completely casual, "I figured you'd get home on your own." I reminded him that we'd agreed he would pick me up, that he was the one who suggested it. Dean looked at me like I was making it up. "I don't remember saying that. You must have misunderstood." The way he said it made me pause. Not because I doubted my memory, but because of how completely calm he was, as if he truly believed what he was saying. I stayed quiet. I didn't argue. Not because I believed him, but because I didn't see the point. A small thing like that didn't seem worth turning into a fight. At least that's what I thought then. But more small comments started to show up. Every time I finished the housework before he got home, he'd laugh. "Do you always have to do everything yourself?" When I fixed a shelf with a loose hinge, he watched and said, "What's the problem with letting me do it? You keep trying to act strong." When I turned down his help for something I could do alone, he sighed. "If you keep being like that, what's left for a husband to do?" Each line was light. No one listening from the outside would hear anything wrong. But over time, they got sharper. I realized they weren't compliments. They were like little blocks he set around me, one by one, building a frame I'd never asked for. Another time, when I told him about a decision I'd thought through carefully, he reacted with, "You always do whatever you want." I said he could share his opinion too. Dean frowned. "I already did. You didn't listen." But I remembered clearly. That night, he just nodded and said, "Yeah, whatever you want." I looked at him. I didn't argue. But inside, I noted the oddness of it. I started to see a pattern. He'd say something. When I responded, he'd say I remembered wrong, or that I was too sensitive, or that I was making a big deal out of nothing. And in those moments, he was always calmer than me. His voice steady, certain, like he was the one analyzing a problem I hadn't caught up to yet. One comment is fine. 2, maybe. But when the same kind keeps repeating, they stop being harmless. And what made me stop really stop was the time he said, "You don't need anyone. You never actually needed me." The way he said it didn't sound sad. It didn't sound hurt. It sounded like an accusation he'd been waiting to deliver. I asked why he thought that. Dean said, "The way you live shows it." I remember standing in front of him, my hand resting on the counter, feeling strangely calm. I wasn't angry, just clear. Clear enough to feel the cold edge in that sentence. It wasn't a comment. It was a message. You need to shrink so I won't feel small next to you. I didn't say anything else. Dean looked at me, expecting a big reaction. I didn't give him one. And from that moment on, I started realizing this didn't begin with the sentence he threw at me in the kitchen tonight. It began with the tiny ones, the lines that made me question myself even though I'd always trusted my own judgment. The worst part wasn't the things he said. It was that I once thought they were harmless. And that's when I understood. This story started long before I noticed. After that day, I started seeing everything more clearly, not because something big happened, but because the small things showed up so often I couldn't ignore them anymore. Dean began correcting me whenever someone else was around. Even if I said something simple, he'd find a way to fix it, like I'd just messed up some important detail. Once, I told his close friends that we planned to reorganize the storage room over the weekend. Dean jumped in right away. "No, what she means is she wants to do it herself. Kara likes handling everything on her own." I just looked at him. What I'd said was nothing like that. I never said I wanted to do it alone. But Dean said it with such certainty that everyone believed him. And when I tried to clarify, he gave a small laugh. "I'm kidding, Kara. You're too serious." Lines like, "You don't need anyone," slowly became his catchphrase. At first, once a week, then every few days. Then it turned into Dean's reflex whenever I did something he couldn't control. I didn't react. I just listened. But the more I listened, the more I felt there was something sitting underneath all that politeness. Dean started putting me in situations where I had to handle things myself, then turned around and blamed me for handling them. One day, we went out to eat with his friends. He said he'd make a reservation. When we arrived, there was none. I stayed calm, sorted it out, and found another table. As soon as we sat down, Dean said, "See? You always act like you don't need anyone. Most people would be flustered. You just take charge right away." His tone wasn't philosophical, just steady, like he was reading the conclusion of some study about my personality. That's when the contradiction became obvious. He was creating situations where I had no choice but to handle things myself, then using that as proof that I was too independent. Every time it happened, it felt like it validated his own narrative even more. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't complain. I just watched and noted every detail. In my mind, his comments stopped being observations, and they felt like small clamps tightening around the space I stood in. Each one light enough that others would think he was just being honest, but sharp enough that I knew he was trying to place me somewhere I hadn't chosen. One evening, Dean told a story to a mutual friend that I knew inside out. What he said was completely wrong. He said I'd forgotten their child's birthday, when in reality, I was the one who reminded him to buy a gift. When I gently said, "That's not how it happened," Dean turned to me and smiled like he was soothing a child. "Kara, you're being too sensitive. I'm just joking." He said it loud enough for everyone to hear, so they'd think I was overreacting, so they'd believe he was the calm one in this marriage. I didn't argue, because I knew if I kept talking, anything I said would be used as proof of the sensitive label he just pinned on me. It was a small moment, but it was the first real cut that woke me up. Other changes started to show up, nothing obvious, but clear enough for me to store away. Dean suddenly began waking up early to go to the gym. The man who'd spent years saying he hated the smell of gyms was now getting up an hour before me. He came home with his hair styled neatly, a new t-shirt, and a cologne scent I didn't recognize. I watched these changes the way you look at footprints in the snow shallow, but unmistakable. He started caring about his clothes. Too much. For 2 weeks straight, he stood in front of the mirror picking out shirts, adjusting collars, changing his hairstyle. When he caught me watching, he laughed. Guys need to look put together too. And Kara. Then came the catching up with old friends he hadn't seen in years. Once, then twice, then several times a week. Whenever I asked, he always had a perfect reason. My friend's back in town. It'd be rude not to meet up. I want to get in better shape. I need to change my routine. I never cornered him. I never interrogated him. Each time, I only asked one simple question in the calmest tone. Where are you going today? And he always answered smoothly. Too smoothly. I didn't suspect anything right away. I'm not the type to see one change and jump straight to betrayal. But I noted each detail like someone laying small pieces of glass on a table just to see whether they eventually formed a picture. Dean started coming home late more often. Whenever I glanced at the time, he'd say, "Fart, we were just talking a bit longer." Nothing was blatantly suspicious, just convenient. Every excuse fit too neatly. I wasn't upset. I only noticed one thing. He was building a story about a man improving his life, but that story didn't include me. At the end of that month, on a very quiet night, while I was reading beside him, Dean said, "I don't know in what way you even need me. You always take care of everything yourself." He said it like it was the conclusion of months of observation. I looked up at him. No reaction, no correction, no explanation. In that moment, I didn't hear his voice anymore. I heard what sat underneath it. It wasn't about my independence. It wasn't about me handling things. It wasn't about him wanting to help. It was about him needing me to shrink so he could feel big enough. Nyra, I don't know what he really wants, I thought. But I'm starting to understand. What he wants isn't a wife. It's someone dependent. And from that second on, I was fully awake. Dean crossed the line on a night that felt completely ordinary. We were cleaning up after dinner. No argument, no tension. He set a plate down, looked at me, and said very clearly, "If you were less independent, this marriage would be easier to breathe in." There was no emotion in his voice, just a conclusion. Like he'd been thinking it for a long time and finally decided this was the moment to say it. I looked at him, not angry, not surprised, just observing. The way he said it, the way he stood there, the way he looked at me like I was a problem he couldn't solve. "Yeah," I answered softly. Just one syllable. He waited for a bigger reaction, but nothing came. And it was my silence that made the next thing unravel more easily. 2 days later, I found a dinner receipt. A restaurant I knew Dean had never invited me to. The kind of place where you have to book a table with dim lighting and expensive wine. And on the receipt was a dessert for two. Dean had said that night he grabbed a quick meal with a coworker. I held the receipt for a long time, not because of the cost, but because of how calm I was. I thought I'd hurt, or get angry, or feel betrayed, but what I felt was a quiet that chilled me. Like I'd known this in my bones already and was just waiting for evidence to confirm it. I didn't confront him. I didn't call him. I didn't ask. The next day, I saw a reservation message on his phone. I hadn't been searching. The screen lit up while he'd left it on the counter. And a message from the restaurant. Reservation confirmed for two. I looked at it for a few seconds and put the phone back down. I didn't open it. I didn't take a picture. I didn't dig. I didn't need more pieces. The truth was clear enough and cold. That night, I sat alone and laid out every fragment I'd collected over the past weeks. Every line Dean said, every inconsistency, every time he made me question my own intuition. I realized Dean's gaslighting didn't come from him not understanding me. It wasn't because I was too strong. It wasn't because he wanted to feel useful. It was because he needed me busy doubting myself, so I wouldn't see what was actually happening. My independence wasn't the problem. The problem was that it made it harder for him to hide his betrayal. Someone who wants to hide something always needs the other person distracted. And Dean used my own awareness as the point of attack. He needed me to question myself. He needed me to shrink. He needed me to believe I was the reason the marriage felt off track, while he was the one standing behind that shift. Seeing that, I didn't feel pain. I just felt clarity. Clarity sharp enough that there was nothing left to ask. The chance for everything to come to light showed up that weekend when we went to a gathering with mutual friends. A soft, easy evening. Everyone was in a good mood. I stepped aside to get a drink and heard Dean's voice behind me. Kara's too strong. I feel like I don't have a role anymore. She does everything herself. Living with someone who doesn't need you, it's exhausting. He said it with this half-sad, half-defeated tone, like he was the one hurting in this marriage. I was standing 2 meters away. He didn't know I heard him. The group went quiet for a few seconds, then nodded as if they understood. Oh, what he told them wasn't the truth. It was a polished version where he looked like the victim, and I looked like the cold, distant wife. I waited to hear what else he'd say. And he did. You guys don't get it. When a woman is too independent, a man doesn't know what he's even needed for anymore. That line wasn't accidental. It was preparation. The next chapter of the story he'd been building for months. I walked toward them. Not fast, not loud. Dean was standing with his back to me, a glass of wine in hand, looking perfectly comfortable using me as the backdrop for his self-pity. He turned when he noticed the sudden silence, and I looked him straight in the eye, not angry, just cold. I heard you're exhausted because I'm too independent, I said. My voice wasn't any louder than it needed to be. Dean opened his mouth. Kara, I cut him off, but not sharply. Good. Then let me tell you something. Right here, in front of the people you want to believe the story you just told. No one moved. Dean froze, like someone had pinned him to the floor. You say you don't have a role, I went on, but there's one role you've been very committed to, the role of a man who has dinner with another woman, then tries to hide it by claiming his wife is too independent to need him. The glass in Dean's hand trembled a little. He tried to say something, but nothing came out. His eyes widened, not because he felt insulted, but because the truth was too direct, too clear to defend against. I didn't yell. I didn't say the other woman's name. I didn't hold up evidence. I didn't need to. The truth only needs to hit the center once for every sound around it to stop. The whole group went still. A few people looked away. The air turned cold instantly. Dean stared at me like I'd just pulled off a mask he thought no one could see. I said one last line, quiet as a breath. I don't need to raise my voice. The truth is loud enough. Then I walked away. I didn't wait for his response. I didn't check anyone's reaction. I didn't need to know what they thought. The impact of exposure doesn't come from chaos. It comes from the silence that falls after the truth lands. And in that moment, Dean lost the one thing he'd held onto the tightest, control of the narrative. After that night, I said nothing more to him, not because I was avoiding him, but because I wanted to see what he'd do when the story he built collapsed right in front of the people he tried to convince. For 3 days, I stayed quiet, just observed. Dean, meanwhile, spun every angle he could to paint over the truth with a different color. On the first day, he avoided my eyes. He didn't say a word all evening, like he was giving me space to calm down. On the second day, he started circling back to familiar lines. Kara, I strayed because you were so distant. If you weren't so cold, I wouldn't have looked for attention elsewhere. I was weak, but it's not entirely my fault. I listened to every line, but I didn't react. My silence bothered him more than anything. Dean couldn't stand that I wasn't curling inward under his blame. No counter accusations, no pleas, no explanations, Just him shifting responsibility onto me with a calmness he hoped looked sincere. Every time he said, "Because of you," I looked at him the way you look at a model you've just taken apart. I could see its structure clearly. Every piece of gaslighting he'd used over time was right there, turning his mistakes into my shortcomings, turning his betrayal into a reaction to my personality, turning my silence into proof that I was distant, all tools, not feelings. Dean wasn't remorseful. He was scared because the control he relied on was slipping. Those 3 days were enough for me to see the full pattern. I realized none of his lines had ever been accidental. Each one was designed to lead me back to a single question. Is this my fault? Someone telling the truth doesn't need to repeat themselves until the words haunt you. Someone acting by accident doesn't stay this consistent in denying your reality. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger disappears once the truth stands fully in front of you, and in its place comes a clarity sharp enough to make others step back. And that was the moment I knew I had to leave. Not because he cheated, not because he gaslit me, but because I couldn't stay in a marriage built out of accusations wrapped in politeness. On the 4th morning, I woke up early. The house was quiet. Dean was still asleep. I looked around and realized I didn't need to take much. I didn't need evidence or memories. And I only needed to take back my self-respect, the part I'd let him touch for far too long. I grabbed a small piece of paper and wrote one sentence. The handwriting was steady, not shaken. I was never too independent. You just got too used to me shrinking. Not long enough to explain, not soft enough to reconnect, just enough to put the truth where it belonged. I left the note on the kitchen table, not folded, not hidden. Anyone walking in could see it, and Dean would see it first. After that, I packed only what I needed, a small bag, important papers, the wedding ring I placed back in its box, not because I cherished it, but because I wanted to return to him what was his and leave without carrying a single trace of this marriage. When I stepped outside, the morning light was cold and still. My footsteps weren't rushed, and I didn't feel like I was running from anything. I walked as if this was simply the last stretch of a road I'd been traveling for far too long. I had just reached for my car door when I heard Dean behind me. "Kara, wait." His voice didn't sound like it usually did. It was full of panic, but layered with the same pride he always carried, like he was slipping, but still trying to look steady. I turned around. I didn't say anything. Dean hurried over, trying to hold himself together. "Kara, you misunderstood everything. I messed up because I was weak, but leaving like this, that's too much." I looked at him. There was no remorse in his eyes, only fear of losing the version of me he depended on, the one who always stepped back half a pace so he could feel bigger. I spoke softly without bitterness. "You're not afraid of losing me. You're afraid of losing control over me." Dean's face went pale. He shook his head fast, like he could erase the sentence from the air. "Kara, why would you say that? I'm trying to fix things." I stood tall. "You can't fix what you won't admit." Dean stepped closer, as if being physically near me would make me soften. "Kara, come back inside and talk like adults. Don't make this difficult." I looked at him for a long moment, not sad, not angry, just looking. Then I said the one thing I knew would hit the part of him he kept hidden the most. "Dean, you didn't lose me because I'm independent. You lost me because I finally see you clearly." He froze. He couldn't find a single line to flip the moment. There was no room left to spin anything. I opened the car door. Dean lifted his hand as if to stop me, but didn't touch me. He knew I wouldn't let him touch me again. Not after the truth was out. Before getting into the car, I turned back and said the final line, the one that cut off every bit of power he thought he had. "You didn't need me dependent. You needed me blind, and I'm not blind anymore." Dean stepped back a little, as if pushed by something invisible. It wasn't the sentence that hurt him. It was realizing he no longer had any gaslighting left that could make me doubt myself. I closed the car door. He stood there, his face a mix of confusion and shock. The first time in his life he wasn't standing in the higher position. I started the engine and drove away. No looking in the mirror, no turning back, no need. My leaving said everything else. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city. Nothing dramatic changed. No standing on the balcony crying. No colorful rebirth montage like in a movie. Just a quiet space where the morning light came through the window without being dimmed by anyone's sighs. I slept more deeply. Sometimes, when I woke in the middle of the night, I heard something I didn't realize I lost. Peace in my own mind. Not the flashy kind of relief. Just the feeling of no longer having someone circling around me, waiting for a chance to correct what I said or twist my actions into something that was my fault. I made simple breakfasts, sat and ate alone. No one there to comment on why I did everything too quickly or handled everything myself. The place was small, but there were no echoes of those little lines that once made me doubt myself. In that quiet, I looked back at my marriage, not to hurt, but to understand. Gaslighting isn't shouting. It doesn't come from explosions. It comes from small lines, repeated, light enough that no one else notices, but sharp enough to carve into your thoughts little by little. It's like someone shifts the map in your head by a millimeter at a time until you no longer trust where you're standing. Dean didn't make me weak. He just tried to make me believe my strength was a problem. But my independence was never the reason the marriage fell apart. It was simply the one thing he couldn't control. I used to think that if I softened, he'd be less irritated. If I asked for his help more, he'd feel important. If I shrank myself, he'd stop seeing me as a reminder of everything he lacked. But the truth was much simpler. No one can make themselves small enough to satisfy someone hiding their own betrayal. I understood that I didn't leave to punish Dean. I left to put power back where it belonged. With me. The power he thought he had was borrowed from my trust and my silence. When I took both back, he had nothing left to stand on. The way I walked away wasn't meant to hurt him. It was meant to stop hurting me. I didn't get revenge with tears or long accusations. I got it by stepping out of the role he thought I'd stay in forever. I walked out of that marriage with one thing crystal clear. Self-respect isn't something you negotiate, and no one has the right to ask you to trade it just to keep them. When the late day light came through the window, I opened it and looked down at the steady traffic below. Sunlight fell across my hand. I thought about something Dean once said. If you were less independent, and this marriage would be easier. Now I see it plainly. It wasn't that I was too independent. It was that he got too used to me shrinking. I rested my hand on the windowsill, light and calm. I don't regret anything. I don't need Dean to understand. I don't need him to look back. Because when the truth is finally spoken with enough clarity, it doesn't just expose the wrong person. It frees the right one. I keep living, day by day, quietly, without tallying wins or losses, just living with the peace I return to myself. And if someone asks me whether I regret it, I'll answer simply, I only regret seeing everything a little late. But late is still better than never, and leaving is still stronger than staying in a place where there's no room for the truth. If you're listening to this story, I want to ask you one question. The question I wish I'd asked myself sooner. What will you do when the person you love needs you to shrink so they can feel big enough? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd really like to hear them. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for listening to a story that wasn't easy to tell, but needed to be said clearly. See you in the next one.